Okay, well, let's just crack on. My name is Austin Williams. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project, and a very warm welcome to everybody, obviously, to this special Bookshop Barnie. It's an international edition. Good evening in the UK, good morning in California, good night to Vienna. We'll be discussing Michael Shellenberger's book on Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Here's a copy. Just as a quick reminder that the next Barnie, which is in exactly 1 month's time, 18th of March, we'll be discussing Paul Embury's book, which is Despised Why the Radical Left Loathes the Working Class, which has kind of got him some flack in the press. So there seems to be a theme developing here amongst these Barnies. The purpose of the Barnie, the discussion, is for the author, Michael Shellenberger, to convince you to read it if you haven't already. If you have, you're still welcome. And for those people who believe that when it comes to the environment, the debate is over, then maybe this conversation isn't for you. Actually, environmentalists aren't great at starting conversations. They're always afraid of breaking the ice. The Los Angeles Review of Books called this one an anti-green contrarianism, while the Wall Street Journal says that it debunks myth after gloomy myth. Personally, I think it's a terrific read, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And the point about this discussion is that you can make your own mind up in some ways. And we're going to flash up the Amazon link occasionally for you to click through if you want to buy it as we go. Environmentalism came to popular attention with Al Gore's documentary, which is talked about time and time and time again, some kind of social media algorithm, as we call it in comedy circles. So Michael Shellenberger is zooming in from California. He's regularly been accused of being a climate denier, but then again, Wikipedia describes him as an ex-PR guy. So I don't know which is worse, really. But ironically, or coincidentally, or more meaningfully, he's been a climate and environmental activist for over 30 years. And for anybody who's bothered to read this book, it's a very well-researched and well-considered series of opinions, facts, data, and propositions. Highly recommended. So the way that the Barnie will work is that I will allow or give Michael 5 minutes or so to kind of posit the book, to try and sell it to you. I'll then ask maybe 4 or 5 questions, if that's okay, to give Michael a bit more time to kind of frame out his own perspective on this, to give you a better idea about where he's coming from. And then it's out to you, the audience, for comments, questions, considerations. Yes. So could we start off? If we could unmute everybody, that would be really nice, if it's possible, or unmute yourselves, and give a round of applause for Michael for taking the time out to talk to us. That we'd much obliged to do. We can come and do your introduction.
Are we ready?
We are indeed. Over to you, mate.
Thanks for having me, everybody. So let's see, as background, I've been an environmental activist for 30 years. I've been a climate activist for 20 years. I'm an energy and food expert, testified in front of Congress. I'll testify for my 4th time this year, next week. I'm also a journalist. I write for Forbes and other publications. Apocalypse Never is my 2nd book. And I wrote it for several reasons. The first is that I thought that the conversation about environmental issues had just gotten too apocalyptic, too hysterical, too decoupled from basic facts. I'm struck that most people don't know basic facts about the environment, that they're not taught very basic facts. They're often taught things that are not true. And this is starting to have significant psychological impacts. 1 out of 5 British children report nightmares about climate change. Half of all people surveyed in a major global survey say that they think that humans will go extinct because of climate change. I'm also concerned by some of the actions of my fellow environmentalists. They oppose natural gas and nuclear, even though those are the 2 technologies that have reduced air pollution the most. They tend to fight hydroelectric dams, any form of reliable power for poor countries, and they tend to oppose both agricultural modernization and industrialization for poor countries, even though that's the only way we know how to lift people out of poverty. So there's some basic things I think that are important to know. My view, climate change is real, but it's not the end of the world. We're making very good progress on it already. Carbon emissions peaked in Britain, France, and Germany in the mid-70s. They peaked in the United States and Canada about 15 years ago, almost entirely due to natural gas and nuclear power. Deaths from natural disasters have declined over 90% over the last 100 years. 411 Americans died of natural disasters in the year 2011. Just to put that number in context, about 50,000 people were killed in car accidents, and the number of people who died of drug overdoses was over 80,000. So we have a huge plan to deal with climate change. We have no plan to deal with rising overdose deaths in the Biden administration. And there's no scenario in any of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports for that death toll to reverse itself and for suddenly tens of thousands of people to die from natural disasters. In fact, the IPCC doesn't predict anybody will die from climate change. We should expect to see continuing declines of death from natural disasters and infectious diseases, assuming we don't have a pandemic every couple of decades, but we should continue to see very significant declines. So what's going on? I think that a lot of the apocalyptic environmentalism is driven by a search for meaning and purpose and fulfillment. Life is boring in rich countries. You need some way to make yourself feel important and to feel like you have some amount of transcendence. One way to do that is and to gain social power and political power by scaring people, making pretty outlandish demands. And I think some of it is also a desire to kind of gain control over food and energy production globally. There's a lot of financial interests that are involved in all of these things. Is that 5 minutes, Austin?
Yeah, well, as near as damn it, and we'll fill it out now anyway. So yeah. that was a good. Yeah. I think you covered a lot of bases there already, to be honest, Michael. But let me just go through a couple of things which have come up as I've gone through it. Obviously, as I've already admitted to you, I'm a big fan of the book. So, but I'm still going to ask you some critical questions, if that's all right. And I'll start off. Because you have been criticized for this book. There's probably more critical reviews, negative reviews than there are positive ones, which maybe says that you're doing something right. But you have been accused of being dangerously naive. And one of the reviews by Peter Gleic, who I'm sure you know, who's a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, so he's no intellectual slouch, criticizes you for believing that economic growth and technological innovation will solve whatever environmental problem we're confronted by. I'm just wondering how you actually confront his precautionary principle. You know what I mean? Like the precautionary principle says we should rein in our ambitions because it's a safer bet. We shouldn't do things today in case it's harmful for the future. But you seem to be saying that we should do all we can today and it will make things better. So how do you win Peter Gleic over?
Well, just on the first point, it's not the case that my book has been more criticized than praised. My book was praised by Steven Pinker, Richard Rhodes, the author of The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which won the Pulitzer, called it a very important book. It was praised by Oliver Stone. It was praised by two of the world's most famous climate scientists, including Tom Wigley, who invented modern climate science and climate modeling. He called it the best book ever written on the environment. And he's someone that is very concerned about climate change. Peter Gleic is someone that was caught fabricating fake memos, purporting to come from climate skeptics about him. He was caught doing that. I don't think he's somebody that has a very strong reputation. Nonetheless, I did respond to his criticism. It's mostly a misrepresentation of my argument. At no point do I argue that economic growth simply solves all environmental problems. It's not something I believe. It's not something I've ever believed. And it's certainly not something I wrote in Apocalypse Never. In fact, what I point to in Apocalypse Never is that there's actually a bunch of technologies that we should be using and we're not using because of people like Peter Gleic, because people that actually want to have social and political control, they don't want abundant food and energy. We have it anyway. We produce 25% more food than we need, larger food surpluses than in any other period in recorded history. We reduce the amount of water that we've been using in agriculture. And we've made all sorts of improvements to efficiency. Is there a market signal that's important to stimulating innovation and economic growth? Of course there is, right? We didn't save the whales through spiritual transcendence or even political regulations. We saved the whales because we switched from whale oil to petroleum in the 19th century. And then the Europeans switched from whale oil for soap and margarine to palm oil and other vegetable oils. But this is not the book is not making a sort of simplistic, economic growth equals good things argument. I point to very specific patterns, particularly energy transitions, and really a phenomenon that I think is been poorly discussed, but is basically a trend of declining material intensity or declining material throughput, along with rising energy intensity, rising energy consumption. So we should be seeking to reduce material throughput, material consumption, or natural resource consumption, but that's going to require a lot of energy, and almost all energy is very dematerialized already. But there's other things, like I point out that we should be eating more artificial fish and less wild fish, so we can leave more wild fish in the oceans for sea life. Well, the greatest obstacle to farmed fish comes from environmentalists who mistakenly think that consuming wild fish, it's bizarre to me, is better for the natural environment somehow. Really, you want to use artificial products. So I point out in my chapter on plastics, my plastic glasses, they're fake tortoise shell. You can see it's called tortoise shell. It's made out of petroleum plastics. This was critical to saving actual sea turtles that were being used to make bioplastics. Another myth is that bioplastics, biofuels are better than so-called artificial fuels, artificial plastics, when in fact the artificial products are the key to saving many aspects of the natural environment.
Okay, I mean, there's a great chapter on whales, turtles, whatever it might be. That idea that artificial products are in many ways an enhancement on the natural, is well worth kind of going through. But I was primarily looking at your response to the precautionary principle. So I'm not really having a go at you about misrepresenting facts or any of those kind of other criticisms that have happened. But the precaution principle is a phenomenal kind of attack on progress, on the future. So I just wondered how you responded.
I mean, the precautionary principle is completely, first of all, it's not obvious to anybody what it even means. In other words, we should only take actions that we are sure will not lead to harm. So don't get out of bed in the morning, but don't stay in bed either, because a lot of people die in bed. I mean, don't live. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's never made any sense philosophically. You have to make choices. I think what the precautionary principle actually speaks to is the issue that I addressed in the last chapter, which is I think there's a social insecurity and an existential anxiety, by which I mean a spiritual anxiety, that is behind a lot of environmentalism. You can see, for example, in this desire for something called sustainability. What does that mean, sustainability? Nobody really wants sustainability. What most people want is change. We want things to get better. We don't want things to stay the same. But if you really look at what people are talking about, or with the precautionary principle, it's a very fear-based idea and it's also, frankly, based on hubris, that you can actually predict the consequences of technologies in advance and decide which ones are safe and which ones are dangerous. Well, if you did that in the 1950s, you would have predicted that nuclear power was the most dangerous way of making electricity. Well, we now know 60 years later, it's the safest way to make electricity. And this is not me, this is Lancet, this is every major scientific study. So it's just a precautionary principle is just really a piece of rhetoric. I mean, I don't even address it in the book because I think it's so transparently dumb. I'm sort of surprised that people will take it seriously, but it obviously works emotionally, which is why Peter Gleic and others use it to kind of paint a caricature of me and others who point to the benefits of progress. It's kind of a way of we should just not do anything different because there might be some harm associated with it.
Sure, sure, sure. I mean, obviously, I might be with you, but obviously, it's the Brundtland report. It's a statement which every student of mine has known. Any country in the world, any 18-year-old or 25-year-old can recite it verbatim. So, it has a purchase. So even though we might kind of want it to be ludicrous, it's taken on board by an awful lot of people. And so, just following on from that and what you said in your introduction, you have a very interesting section on the kind of rise of anxiety and depression amongst school-aged children, the Greta Thunberg effect in some ways, and you say it's a chronic fear of environmental doom. But as you say that, children are resilient, and I just worry. I worry. I'm concerned about overstating the fear of psychological harm. It's that fine line, isn't it, between, like the COVID schools lockdown, there's undoubtedly some devastating consequences, but we mustn't indulge in psychological alarmism at the same time. So how do you kind of balance some of these risks?
Well, I wrote the book in part so that people would have a way to balance the risks themselves. You know, I mean, I don't think there's for me, I think it's the solution to all of this is to actually get educated. And so people go through college and get environmental studies degrees and don't know some of the most basic facts about these issues. So I think there's no, is there a risk of being too alarmed about the alarmism? Sure. Let's not do that.
Okay. All right. Well, we don't want to talk ourselves into a mental health crisis, which is what I'm worried about, which is actually what's happening. So that's the reason I raise it. Not, I can say, not necessarily on the terms of the environment, but also in terms of COVID safetyism as a predominant moment in our era. So let me just move on to your nuclear thing. Again, you've already mentioned it, and I just wanted to ask you whether, I mean, you're not going to agree with me, but is there a little bit of conspiratorial thinking within your argument? Or let me put it another way. Explain to me why it isn't conspiratorial. Because you are pointing out that the oil, I mean, and I'll paraphrase, but you're pointing out that the gas and oil industry are kind of key funders in some respects of environmental groups. That there's two reasons. One is that they're opposed to nuclear power because it's a real alternative to fossil fuel, and that's kind of a straightforward competitive advantage that they're arguing for. And secondly, you say that actually renewable resources actually have intermittency, and therefore they'll always need gas and oil as a backup to the fact that they don't, the sun doesn't shine in the nighttime and everything. My concern with that straightforward observation is that they are still backing a horse that is intrinsically opposed to their interests. Which I'm just generally fascinated by. As an example, just 2 days ago, Extinction Rebellion has just launched a campaign for whistleblowers for employees of Shell and Exxon to call out any actions that will damage the planet. So, is the oil and gas industry really playing with fire, if you excuse the pun? Are they really in bed with the wrong ally here? What's really going on?
So the last 3 chapters of the book deal with what I see as the 3 biggest factors behind apocalyptic environmentalism, and they are basically money, power, and religion. And by religion, I mean religion. So there's 3 factors. I deal with each of them separately because they deserve their own chapter. I document at great length significant multi-million-dollar investments from oil and gas and other fossil fuel interests to anti-nuclear groups going back 40 years. So to the extent to which it's a conspiracy, it's an open one. I think of it this way, sometimes people say to me, they say, do they know, or how high up does it go? Or are you saying that they don't also believe in what they're saying? And I point out, look, when the conquistadores went to Mexico and Latin America in the 16th century, they were Catholics. They really were Catholics. It wasn't just a joke. But they also wanted the gold. So the 2 things are not incompatible. In fact, they go very well together. It's much easier to sell things that you believe in. I don't know if it's possible for people to be effective salespeople of things they don't believe in. So if you really believe in, I think Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg and the heads of the big environmental groups really believe in renewables. And I think it's a spiritual quest And I don't think they could have staffs and budgets of $100 million a year if it wasn't good for the oil and gas industry.
So just develop it again for people who haven't read the book, develop just very in a snapshot way, if you could, why it is good for the oil and gas industry. What is it that they're backing solar power, BP beyond petroleum? What is that about?
I mean, just think about it. Since the 1950s, we have been able to produce all of our electricity if we wanted to, and a significant amount of our heat and hydrogen gas and desalinated water from nuclear power. Like there's really no need for fossil fuels. So from an environmental perspective, nuclear is a really straightforward solution, and it's been implemented at scale around the world. France is the most famous, 75% of its electricity from nuclear. They produce electricity with 1/10 of the carbon emissions as Germany does at about half the price. So why mess around with renewables? Why mess around with fossil fuels? You can see nuclear is a very threatening technology. It is usually not possible for incumbent technologies to block new technologies. If they could, then newspapers would have stopped the internet. In this case, nuclear is handicapped by the fact that it is also the way to make the most powerful weapons we've ever been able to make. And so it's been a technology that's been restricted, highly restricted for that reason, and also been easy to demonize, because most people, when you say nuclear, what they think of is weapons, not power plants. And when you try to tell them that they are not related, they don't believe you for good reason, because they are related. So really, I don't think that the political conspiracy or the economic demands or even the will to power are sufficient explanations. I think that really what's behind nuclear is its incredible destructive potential, which is matched, of course, by its incredible positive creative potential. But I think it's very hard for people. I think it requires basically an evolution of consciousness to move beyond the ways that we've moved beyond basically the chemical revolution in fuels and firearms to the nuclear revolution.
But is it the case that the oil and gas industry can't defend themselves in their own terms? They can't defend oil and gas per se, because what I'm saying you're saying in the book in some respects is that they're actually hiding behind kind of this new environmental revolution to justify themselves for the next round of publicity or accumulation or whatever you want to call it. So why is it not that the oil industry is not shouting from the rafters the benefits of oil and gas?
Well, they do. I mean, they do that as well. But renewables are ridiculously popular. I mean, it's like 70 to 80% public support for solar and wind. In the abstract, not when they're built near you, but certainly in the abstract, they're extremely popular. And so we saw Total and Shell and BP, all these companies have made big investments in renewables and are out there promoting renewables ostensibly because they know that in order to integrate renewables into a grid that requires 100% reliability, you have to back them up with natural gas. Like you can't, to give you a sense of it, when France said we want to do more wind so that they can harmonize with Gaia. And so they reduced the amount of nuclear they did, expanded the amount of wind, and they had to use more natural gas. So the carbon intensity of French electricity actually went up when they increased the amount of renewables that they used. So, I mean, how do you explain that? Also, it raised the cost of electricity. How do you explain that other than as a kind of mixed economic and religious motivation? I mean, that's how I see it. It's economics, politics, and religion. Okay,
well, we'll come to that in a moment. But in terms of the section, again, really interesting section you have on development generally, I noticed that Bill Gates's book has been getting a lot of traction. It's Book of the Week on BBC this week. And he notes, just as one example, like you do, that there's a lot of poor people in the world, like in the Congo, which you talk about, burning wood for fuel because that's all they have, that's all they can do, yes? And he says, there's no incentive for them not to burn wood. That's what they have. So his solution is to pay them to protect the forests so they get the financial returns, they don't burn the wood, it becomes financially advantageous for them to kind of help the climate. And there seems to be many projects, increasing projects, effectively paying people, paying countries not to develop in some respects. And you describe some of this as neo-colonialism. So I just wonder if you could explain what your take on this equation is.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the case since the 70s. You've had so-called progressive organizations, so-called charitable, so-called developmental organizations, basically trying to keep poor countries using renewables. I mean, renewables is what everybody used until the Industrial Revolution. We now know that you could not have had the Industrial Revolution on renewables for basic physical reasons. Wood does not produce sufficient amounts of energy to power modern factories, and we just had a scarcity of wood. You needed coal to have the Industrial Revolution. You needed oil and gas to have transportation revolution, and then the heating and cooking revolutions. So to want to prevent poor countries from having modern energy is a strategy to prevent them from developing economically, and that's been the strategy of. People say neo-colonial. I'm not sure if I used that word. I'm not sure I would, because you got to remember a lot of the colonial powers were trying to develop.
You actually said conservation as neo-colonialism.
Yeah. So the problem with my using that word, colonialism was traditionally about development. And so I think the neo part then means it's actually a kind of thwarting of development. It's the idea that the Congo should stay poor so that we can have safari there. Right? I mean, what could, I mean, that is a bit of the colonial part. The parks themselves in these poor countries were created by colonialists. And then they think wrongly that the threats to those parks come from development. In fact, the threats to those parks come from poverty. Bill Gates wants, I don't know, I haven't read his book, but it sounds like you're saying he wants to pay poor countries not to develop. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, gosh, why would people want to develop?
Well,
hasn't done Gates any good being developed, right?
No, I put that a little bit. I mean, I think Bill Gates might have a row with me if he heard my crude synopsis of his chapter. But what he's arguing about paying people not to burn wood because wood is harmful is the logic of what he's arguing, I think.
Yeah, and that's wrong, because the way that we stop using wood is when we have better alternatives, mostly liquefied petroleum gas in poor countries, or natural gas in most rich countries. I don't know why. I mean, this idea that we want the poor to do something different than us because development is somehow bad, it's offensive, it's wrong, it's unethical, it should be called out. I'm surprised to see that Bill Gates did that, honestly.
Now you're gonna check it out, and we'll find out that I've misrepresented him. But there you go. Unfortunately, we're only recording this. In terms of the section you have on population, because it's one of those annoying things that actually almost running through all of environmental discourse for a long, long time has been this kind of Malthusian streak. As a matter of fact, Peter Gleic, who I mentioned at the very beginning, in his article for Yale, is actually positing Malthusianism as a positive rebuttal to your argument. So, but that idea that, a polite way of saying that there's too many people consuming too many things is essentially it. That's gone from being, and you can see that David Attenborough has just made a statement, and he's made many statements recently about population growth that needs to come to an end. Paul Ehrlich, obviously, is very famous for The Ecologist magazine, et cetera, et cetera. But that's gone from being a fairly kind of right-wing attitude, very often a racist, speaking colonial attitude, to being a kind of a left liberal value. So I just wondered what has occurred and when it occurred, as far as you're concerned.
Yeah, this was something that was really driving me nuts, because the left has traditionally been viewed as pro-progress up until World War II. So I trace it back to after World War II, the conservation movement was taken over by Malthusians. Malthus, of course, was viewed as the left, anti-enlightenment, anti-progress. Why did that get picked up after World War II? I think there's a couple of big reasons. The first is that the left after World War II, the baby boomer new left became anti-development, it became romantic, in ways that were considered more conservative before World War II. They actually challenged the Greatest Generation and Silent Generation in terms of that relationship to development. And that went for housing in the cities to building dams in Africa. It just became an anti-development movement. And then I think the other part of it is the concern, the fears of nuclear weapons. And I couldn't disentangle the two things. It was very hard because they would end up going together. So, but the picture was kind of progress is leading us closer to a nuclear apocalypse. Therefore, we need to go backwards in time, away from nuclear, through fossil fuels, and back towards renewables. That was basically the picture. I don't know how much of it was motivated by the bomb, some amount of it. I can't tell how much of it was rhetorical and how much of it was genuine. Some of it is a kind of decadence. It's the kids after World War II, the boomers, they didn't remember poverty. The middle class educated ones really didn't remember poverty, whereas their parents and grandparents did remember poverty. And I think that I keep finding that where people that have some memory or some experience in real poverty, like Congo poverty and Nicaragua poverty, have a really different relationship and view towards things like capitalism and consumerism than do people that spent their whole life going to prep schools and Ivy League colleges and just never really seeing that world. They end up projecting a kind of romantic fantasy onto poor communities that is generally not shared by those communities.
Okay. There's lots for the audience hopefully to pick up on. But just finally, again, you mentioned the praise given to you by Steven Pinker. He said that you are concerned with, quotes, constructive environmentalism. You say you're an environmental humanist, and then you go and write this book, which is a complete critique of environmentalism, pointing out the problems and the dangers of environmentalism. You point about the value of human specialness. So here I am wondering why you have the prefix environmental before humanist. Why aren't you just a humanist?
I don't know. That's a good question. I am a humanist. It turned out that my conservative friends didn't like the word humanist at all. In the United States, conservatives tend to be very Christian. And they tend to associate humanism with secular humanism. I point out that, in fact, Christianity is a humanist religion in the sense that it puts humans at the top of a hierarchy. It says humans are special. That's all it means. That's all I meant to have it mean. And so, but what I guess what I liked about the term environmental humanist is that it suggested that we're not going to sacrifice human lives for the environment, and that in fact we can realize environmental benefits, environmental progress through human development and by treating humans with dignity. And that actually in the Congo, the people need a hydroelectric dam in the same way that the natural environment would benefit from a hydroelectric dam, because you need cheap power in the cities to power factories, to improve lives and pull people away from the forest frontier, which is where they threaten wildlife. And also, as we saw, for example, in South China with the coronavirus pandemic, that's also the place where you have the spillover of zoonotic viruses. So really this picture of development as one of urbanization, industrialization, is a picture of development that's mostly positive for humans. It doesn't mean that you just let the market decide everything. There are some situations where you're making investments in R&D and you're engaged in regulation, but mostly that is a positive, beneficial process for people and the environment, and we should support it rather than trying to thwart it.
Fine. Michael, thank you very much. That was the painful part over. Thank you very much indeed. Really useful for those of you, like I say, who haven't yet read the book. There's an Amazon link lurking in the chat room for you to click and get a copy anytime you like now. But also it's kind of hopefully food for thought in terms of questions that you might want to raise as we go along. So can I just see if there's any hands out there? There's a blue button. I can never remember how this damn thing works, but effectively, if you click on the participants, you can actually get on and click a little blue hand. Richard Ings is showing you the way. So Richard, we'll come to you. What we'll do, Michael, if you don't mind, we'll just take maybe, well, we'll see how many hands come up, but if we'll take maybe a couple of questions at a time. So that means that if they cover the same ground, you can just answer it in a generic sense, or you can not answer ones you don't like. I mean, I don't mind. Okay, Richard, over to you.
Thanks. I'm testing a new mic, so am I allowed to ask you if you can hear me okay?
You can indeed, and we do.
Okay, brilliant. I love starting with that intervention. I just want to, I mean, I know this is not a discussion about Malthusianism, but it might be interesting to throw in the fact that what you said, Austin, about Malthus being associated with the right wing, I actually think there's potentially, I may disagree with you about that, there may be a correction that needs to be made, that he actually wanted to do it to help people, to keep the population down so that we didn't all starve. So there's a kind of a, you could argue, an anti-capitalist left-wing element to that, which might be interesting to reflect on. I wanted just to interrogate Michael maybe a little bit more on what he was saying about France, because I think it seems to be entirely paradoxical that, you know, France has been so proud of the fact that it's been, you know, able to achieve some kind of energy independence with its nuclear program, but they are actively dismantling it, as I think he obviously realizes, and saying, you know, we need to go green. Now that isn't to say that it's not, you know, being disputed, and there aren't people in France who are saying, what the hell are we doing? But it does seem to be a very, very deliberate strategy to, in effect, denuclearize France. And I wonder, because I don't know how much Michael knows about the sort of the EU and how that works, and I wonder how far the kind of importance of the, if I may put it this way, the imperial standing of the European Union and its kind of overall drive to make Europe the center of renewable energy is in some way important, if he feels that, you know, maybe contributing. Where America fits into that, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe he could add a few thoughts on that as well. But I'm also wondering how far this kind of is playing out deliberately in regards to China, as a kind of almost as a stick to beat them with, because obviously China is very much the heart of the industrial industry at the moment, notwithstanding what's left of American industry, and they're very much focused on fossil fuels and whatnot. And I wonder how far that's what's driving perhaps some of the environmental sort of discussion, is this idea that Europe is in some way morally superior, perhaps, to China, and in leading the way in this clean, modern energy. I just wonder if he's got any thoughts on that.
Very good. All right, hold your fire, Michael, for 1 second. And I'll only just clarify for my own benefit that I was talking about Malthusianism rather than Malthus himself. If that gets me out of a corner, then I'll move on. Liam, next, please.
Hi there. Hi, thanks for letting me ask a question. I'm really wanted to get your perspective on how you think the current crisis and the sense of sort of end of the world doomism that we've entered into is going to affect our ability to talk about difficult issues. And I mean by that the sort of wave of censorship that we've seen be widely adopted, honey TV, by on the internet and all over the media. I mean, there's a sense that, I mean, all over YouTube now, if there's a video about climate change, it comes with a health warning. Here is the Wikipedia link to it, and the BBC here in the UK, an Ofcom ruling a few years ago ruled that TV they can't give a single side of climate change. They have to give both sides. So we're already having a really difficult time talking openly in the media and on social media about sort of climate skepticism in this country, which is really worrying. We've seen that censorship accelerate massively during the coronavirus crisis. The media can't give us both sides because we're too stupid to know. And the same with sort of right-wing terrorist attack, the right-wing and terrorist attacks. We can't give you both sides because the people are too stupid and too fearful to know all the facts. So I was wondering if you writing this book about sort of effectively climate skepticism. In a way, you might not call it that, but others, certainly your opponents, will call it climate skepticism or climate denialism, have faced any censorship? And if you're worried about really your YouTube talks being censored, and if you think that's a real and present threat, because I kind of think it is. But I commend you for writing the book and putting your head above the parapet, because it's as we know, the people in this room will know, we're in a tiny minority. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam. And there may even be people here who disagree, so please feel free to speak your minds. We'll take Joe, Herlihy, and Para, and then I'll come back to Michael, and then I'll come back out to you, everyone. Yes. So, Joe.
Okay, two questions. One is on the question of limits, Michael. You mentioned a couple of times in the book, and I couldn't really get beyond this. I kept thinking about it all the way as I was reading it, as much as I enjoyed it, is that you make the point a number of times about things having peaked, that there's almost like a natural plateau, for example, population. You mentioned yourself in your introduction about, I think it was emissions peaking. And I'm just wondering, I would like to test that and explore that a little bit to say, is it the case that things have peaked, or is it the case that in some ways we've reined things in over the last 20, 30 years in terms of where people are putting their investment resources? So that's just a question to try and unpick that a little bit, because what that sort of suggests is, what happens if the population decided it wanted to go for it and it wanted to expand, and a combination of having either more children or expand the population more? It's just trying to understand what you mean by limits. And then the second thing is about justification. I liked at the end of your book in terms of how you explored some of that, but I wonder, is there not in environmentalism a justification for not growing and not expanding the economy? In Nottingham, it is going for the first carbon neutral city in the country. Funnily enough, it also coincides with the last 30 years of decline in manufacturing, from 50% population, Nottingham population manufacturing, down to now 90% services. So the fact that they're going carbon neutral in one sense doesn't really surprise me, because it's almost like they can't find the knowledge economy isn't quite doing it for them. And I wonder whether that now is almost like their alibi.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Okay, Para, please. Now I'll come back to Michael.
We talked about gas and oil industries. My question relates to big business, because across the board, all of big business have really bought into this whole worry about climate change. So the company I work for, which is a corporate organization, has announced that it's going to become carbon neutral by 2020, carbon negative by 2021, and net zero in 2025, and working out how to contribute to prevent this climate problem. So what do you think is driving all this? So it's become really mainstream, everyone's bought into it, and why is big business bought into it?
Grand. All right. Thank you very much. So if the others can just hold fire for a short while, can I bring back Michael? You're floating out there somewhere. Just come back and see if you can address some of these points.
Yeah, now I'm trying to remember what Richard asked, because
Richard was talking about the old school pen and paper. He's talking about France and their nuclear capacity.
Yeah.
And then he also mentioned China and whether the West was implementing moral superiority over China and their carbon emissions.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like all three questions are asking, well, at least the first and the third are asking questions about what's kind of really going on, what's really behind this. Let me address one of Joe's questions about peak. Yeah, I mean, if I say, if we say newspapers peaked, I'm making a claim that I don't think that that the number of newspapers, that newspapers are gonna make a comeback. They could, you used the example of human population. Could it be that the human population starts to decline and then rebounds? Absolutely, it totally could. Maybe I should have made that clearer. You know, it's certainly part of it comes from when you are looking at resource transitions and energy transitions. You know, coal, it's unlikely to come back in Britain. You know, it's just declined so much because of natural gas and nuclear. It's not to say it would never happen. There's no hard and physical reason that it couldn't happen. But I think it's pretty likely, particularly viewing past transitions. You know, other than in terms of I'll come back to the first question last. In terms of Paris' question around, you know, the industry embrace of climate. I mean, look, for 95, 99% of all companies, it's just like Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's just kind of highly salient with the public, and you also have your employees that are anxious about it and they want the companies to do something. There is no cost among corporate executives to declaring what they will be in the future, usually. If you go back to like the 80s or 90s and you look at the commitments that governments made to carbon emissions, like they're empty promises. Usually the politicians are not in office when the deadlines would be met. So it's often very empty, or there's cases where they'll just buy carbon offsets to claim to be carbon neutral. So for most companies, it's just branding. It's just represents what high-end consumers generally want. On the issue of France and China, yeah, I mean, look, the push for renewables in particular, the push for the gas renewables combination in particular is very strong everywhere. In China and France, I mean, look, in all countries, there's different factions that want different technologies. So in China, you know, there may be a dictatorship of the Communist Party, but within the Communist Party, there's a sector that wants more nuclear. There's a sector that wants more gas and solar. There's a sector that wants more coal. You know, France, same thing. I think there's a lot of, I found the French very anti-nuclear for being a country that is mostly nuclear, the French public. You know, some of this is on the nuclear industry, which is absolutely terrible at human engagement. I mean, at literal human engagement, person to person, but also terrible at marketing. And partly because nuclear tends to be state-owned companies, like it is in France, they're not really in a position to sell themselves particularly well, whereas more private sector operators like renewables can. And then there's just all the overhang I mentioned before about fears of the bomb. I will say one thing though, which is, you know, on this issue of kind of, you know, the relentless, you know, push for renewables and the kind of global element of it, the desire for the Paris Climate Agreement, the sense in which it has to be done globally, which of course contradicts how we've actually reduced emissions. I mean, when Britain, France, and Germany saw their emissions peak in the mid-70s, it wasn't because of climate change and it wasn't because of global action. They just switched to nuclear and gas and moved away from coal. And there's also the process of transitioning from manufacturing to the service economy. So I think that maybe it was Joe was asking, or maybe Richard, which is that there is a sense I get from the West. I see it definitely in Britain. You see it in the United States among the elite, which is like a desire to have more international control. And I think that reflects the class interests of those people that are in the professional managerial class. And a kind of fantasy. John Kerry, who's our new Secretary of State, he wants to think that he is going to shape the global future. I mean, in some ways it's just arrogance, right? He wants to think that. So they go and negotiate this Paris Climate Agreement. It's not a treaty. Like, it's just a public relations exercise. That's all it is. There's no binding nature to the Paris Climate Agreement. But yet, if you read the newspapers, you'd think, oh my gosh, well, Biden's going to get the United States in this climate treaty, and then all of our energy and food decisions are going to be made by the United Nations, and of course, or in the Europe, by Brussels. And most people don't want that, don't believe that. We know it's not how it works. Most energy and food decisions are made locally, regionally, nationally. So, you know, to some extent, there's people on the political right that have been more concerned around like a global takeover. And I just kind of go, you don't need to worry about it because it's just not what's going to happen. In Europe, obviously, you had the EU, but you're also experiencing a backlash against it. So, you know, mostly here in the United States, I just kind of think, in some ways, I think we're at much greater risk of not having enough centralization than of having too much centralization or too much federal or international control. You're muted, Austin.
It's embarrassing when that happens, isn't it? Just to say, as a personal plug, I've stuck my book up there on China just for you to get some background if you want to look into it. Not you, Michael, but to Richard. Second thing is that you've got a very good section in the book. I mean, there's a few fleeting comments about the European Union and their use of tariffs in order to have a go at Bolsonaro, for example, and how they've actually kind of implemented it as an environmental mandate, whereas in fact it's a straightforward kind of trade embargo. And then just finally, if you want to come back on Liam's question, which was about kind of one-sided media coverage, that idea that, especially in the BBC, where they say you can't have both sides because it's such a ludicrous proposition that climate change isn't happening, that we're not going to countenance it, and whether you've experienced any censorship yourself.
Yes, I was censored. So let's see, I think there's two parts to this. The first part is that, yeah, I mean, the left has become very censorious in general. And there's a lot of people that have thought more deeply about why that is than me. I will say my contribution to it, I think, from the environmental side, is I do think apocalyptic environmentalism is the dominant secular religion. I think it functions more as a religion on the left. I think politics functions more as a religion on the left in many ways than it does on the right, at least in the United States, in part because I think the right tends to have traditional religious faith, whereas the left tends to be more atheist or secular ostensibly. And so they have a kind of religious zealotry in terms of speech. They tend to see speech. I'm working on a new book now about a totally unrelated issue, but the left activists are constantly accusing people of things that they say resulting in violence. We see this all the time. If you say that, you're engaged in violence or hate speech. Obviously, I think it's terrible. It's dangerous to a free society. In my case, I was censored by a Facebook fact checker wrongly, who misrepresented the science, then got a post of mine censored, and now there is some secret algorithm against me, and I know this because it's been used against reporters who have covered me, and I have no way of knowing what it is. In fact, it's upset me so much that I've decided that that I'm likely to write a book about social media, because I do think we are in completely unknown territory. Because if everybody gets their news from Twitter and Facebook, and if Twitter and Facebook censor the news, it's not a violation of our First Amendment rights. I don't know what the equivalent is in Britain, but in the United States, if Facebook and Twitter censor somebody, it's not a violation of the First Amendment, because ostensibly you still have your free speech rights. But what does it matter if there's no way to reach anybody? You know, if there's no way, if you're literally blocked on the main channels of reaching somebody, then it really is a kind of censorship. So, but we don't really have the laws or the thinking progressed enough to deal with this. My view is that the social media represent a natural monopoly, that we're not going to move from Facebook and Twitter to Parler or whatever the other alternatives are. It's just not going to happen. And so therefore they constitute a natural monopoly. And at a very minimum, we should have transparency into how these decisions are being made. I should know if there's an algorithm being used to censor my contact in Facebook, I should know what it is, and I should have a chance to appeal it. And there should be some process, some due process. There isn't any of that right now. I think it's a huge problem. I think the political right, which has been most negatively impacted by the censorship, has found itself unable to respond because of its reflexive market liberalism. And so when I talk to my conservative friends about this problem here, they say, well, you don't want any government regulation. So then you're just kind of screwed. So then it's like, okay, fine. So then Facebook and Twitter just completely control. We've handed over all of our free speech rights to two big, very powerful corporations because the left is getting its needs met to censor heterodox views, and the right is incapable of imagining any kind of government regulation that would be beneficial. And I think that's a very, very dangerous place to be as a free society.
Okay, thanks. Just so you know, I got a Facebook warning for posting an advert for this event just yesterday. So comes to us all. Right, we're going to take a few more. Again, if you want to scribble some of these questions down, Michael, or keep them in your head, I'll also make a note of them. But we have Rosie first. I'll take 3 or 4. Yes, so Rosie first.
Hi. So Michael, I really enjoyed reading your book. When it comes to your theory about why environmentalism is attractive, I just thought there was a bit of a gap. I mean, I think you started talking about some of the political and the democratic factors now this evening. The government we've got, I felt, really smuggled in a lot of its environmentalist policies. So I'm interested in what you think as to how generally popular these ideas are. Do you think there's a possibility for, strong democratic challenge? I mean, you've talked about the censorship as a possible factor here, but I am interested in how these ideas get smuggled in, and they're not sort of open parts of manifestos necessarily. They're not the main focus of campaigns. And yet, when they are in and they're enacted, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of opposition either. So I'm just interested in sort of the general attraction of these ideas and whether you think there's a possibility of the demos challenging them.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Rosie. We've got Alex Standish, please. Alex, yes.
Hi, Austin. Thank you. And thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed the book. It's a very comprehensive book. A lot of work has gone into it. I guess my questions sort of follows on nicely from the last one. It's about how to win the argument, really. And I'm a geographer, and so I hang out with geographers sometimes, and quite a few of them masquerade as geographers, but actually they're environmentalists, or maybe they're both. But anyway, you describe this environmentalism as a secular religion. So, and you said earlier, we had a little bit of a conversation earlier about humanism versus environmentalism. But it does seem that for most people they are in opposition, and I would suggest, or maybe you suggest in your book, that the rise of environmentalism today is linked to a decline of belief in humanity and our capacity, and obviously a lot of environmentalists argue that we are part of nature. We can't we can't take control over nature. We can't impose ourselves on nature at all. So it does seem that it's linked to a loss of belief in humanity. So how do we win the argument if it's a problem of belief? It doesn't seem like it's possible to win it through rational argument.
Very interesting. Thank you. Tony Pearce.
Hello. Yes, I haven't read the book, Michael, but I will. But the interesting thought comes to me is what is the basis of making environmentalism acceptable in modern day politics? It seems to me that the concept of not just the precautionary principle, but the polluter must pay. It seems to me that the authoritarian nature of that. It's been the concept's been around for over a century, I know, but the whole issue of polluter must pay for environmental harm seems to be at the core and hasn't been properly tackled in books I've read so far. The issue is who decides who is the polluter, and also what the payment is and to whom. Can you or does your book enlighten us on that? And who acts as the judge and jury when it comes to environmental harm?
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'll take one more, Michael, if that's all right. I'll take Tara McCormack, and then I'll come back to yourself.
Oh,
Hi, Tara.
sorry, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Hi.
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Now I can turn that. So thank you so much, Michael. I have read the book and I really loved it because I felt on the one hand, really, it was so positive about, you know, what we can do to deal with these real problems. And then on the other hand, I felt quite sort of depressed after it because I was thinking like, because so many of the chapters look at the way in which kind of public discourse and science has been, as for various reasons that you discussed, has been kind of manipulated, or you know, the things that can make a difference are kind of pushed out of the public realm in a way. And this is more of a comment. I was just kind of reading today in the last few days, you know, Bill Gates's interviews, you know, saying like, we need to go to war for climate change. It's like being at war. And I thought, wow, okay, climate shutdowns coming next. You know, we've had COVID lockdowns and now we're going to have climate lockdowns. So I was just wondering, you may not want to go there. So no, you know, absolutely no offense if you don't want to go, no offense taken if you don't want to go there. But reading the last chapter, I was really struck by a lot of the similarities, kind of discussions around environmentalism and kind of today around COVID, you know, kind of real problems for sure, but kind of solutions, also concrete solutions, are politicized and not necessarily allowed, you know, and things that we think might be just, you know, obvious. Of course, it's obvious, solar, that sounds like a good idea, you know, actually aren't. So I was just thinking along those kind of lines about politicization and this idea of kind of scientism. Yeah, I couldn't help thinking about reading it very recently, which I just happened to do, your book, and then in the context also of what's going on in terms of COVID, certainly in Europe. I don't know quite what's going on in terms of the US, in that it's quite a different discussion depending on where you are. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Tara. I think it is useful to recognize or remember the fact that, as you say, we have COVID lockdowns, which have all but destroyed the international airline industry. And as soon as we're out of lockdown, the environmental lobby are going to try and kill off the last remaining vestiges of it in order to restrict that evil of flying. So you know, it may compound on what we already have. Look, just before Michael comes back in, just to say, I'm going to come back out for one final round of questions and comments. There's been a little bit of a love-in here with Michael. Even people who haven't read his book seem to enjoy it. So I just wonder if there's anybody out there who's got a critical comment or doesn't agree, or, you know, has something to tackle him on beyond maybe what's been discussed so far. That would be very, very useful. Okay, Michael, do you want to come back on some of these points?
Sure. Let's see, polluter pays. I mean, to some extent, that is the policy that we have, is that the polluters have to pay to dispose of waste, whether it's human waste or chemical or nuclear or whatever. They already do. The people that are often using that argument are trying to justify much more sweeping policies like carbon taxes to make polluters pay. It's a euphemism, obviously, because if we're all polluters and companies that are taxed additionally for pollution will just pass it on to us. So I do find the discourse misleading and disingenuous on the one hand. On the other hand, you know, as you mentioned, the basic principle that, you know, there's some accountability for the waste that we produce has been in place for hundreds of years. I think some of the other questions it seems like are getting at kind of how do we deal with it? What do we do about this apocalyptic environmental movement? And what I say at the end is that I don't see apocalyptic environmentalism going away. I do see it losing some amount of power as people deal with other things. For example, renewables are just facing very significant limits to their ability to expand. They're making electricity expensive because they require so much backup and transmission. I think that some amount of the enthusiasm and the fears of climate change are motivated, this may sound paradoxical, but I think it's the case, are motivated by enthusiasm for renewables. Renewables constitute a kind of material practice to engage in what is basically a religious activity. So Christianity was about getting right by God. Environmentalists want to get right by nature. You get right by nature by using renewables. Why? Because renewables integrate the economy. They actually make the economy and society subordinate to nature. And nature, by nature, I mean nature, the idea of nature, not actual nature. What renewables actually do is degrade the natural environment since they require so much land and materials. So I'm not optimistic that that apocalyptic environmentalism will go away, although I do think it will struggle politically as it is struggling politically. You know, to give you one example, we now know that the vast majority of solar panels are made by the Muslim minority in China under forced labor conditions in a situation that most people think is genocide. That's awkward for solar power advocates. They've had a very awkward time explaining why it's okay to keep buying solar panels from China. I think that awkwardness is going to increase, and China's not going to have a very easy way to move all that solar manufacturing out of that part of China. We keep running into reliability problems as we use renewables. So I think those are the ways in which people seeking to counter the dogmatism are going to be effective. In fact, I'm following this idea up in my next book, which is about our homeless crisis in California. I think that moderates and conservatives who are in opposition to the radical left will do very well if they're pragmatic and not ideological. And that way the dividing line will be around pragmatism and not ideology. I think that the conservative movement is coming out of about 50 years of having fetishized market liberalism, market capitalism. I think markets are great. If you read the book, you know I praise markets for the things that markets are really good at. But markets are a tool of societies. Markets are used by societies. They're allowed by societies. They're in some senses protected by collective action. They don't represent the state of nature, and they're not a substitute for all of the other things that we do as a society to keep ourselves safe. So I think that the ways that we will be able to counter some of this really negative radical left ideology, whether it's from apocalyptic environmentalists or on a range of other issues, by being very pragmatic and by speaking to what's in the common good and the public good, rather than what's in particular pecuniary interests. I'm not sure if I hope I answered most of those questions. Yeah, somebody mentioned in the comments, by the way, I just see about the yellow vests. I think that's exactly the kind of resistance that we're going to see be effective in countering apocalyptic environmentalism.
Fine. Thanks. Sorry, I was going to come back and say there's a couple more bits and bobs, but I think you've probably covered them in a generic response. Okay, look, we've got, let me just see, 5 hands. We'll call it a day on number 5, if that's all right, Michael. Keep all this in your head. Good. Okay, we have Hilary Salt, please.
Yes, so I did want to just be a bit critical of that idea of markets actually being quite helpful, because certainly my experience is I work in the pensions field. In pensions now, pension scheme trustees are required to say how they've addressed climate change in their investment strategy. So what that means is if you launch an infrastructure fund that mentions renewables, for example, that's massively oversubscribed. And the reason it is because people want to tick that compliance box and say they've done what government has told them that they have to do. But because of that, these funds have massively high returns. So, somebody mentioned in the comments box, does it matter that these schemes are expensive? It absolutely doesn't matter, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that they generate massive returns because everybody wants one, partly because of compliance, and then because they have such good returns, everybody wants them even more. So I do think that actually markets have been quite problematic here, but it does start from politicians who I would say have kind of got an exhaustion of kind of political ideology, kind of clinging on to this in the kind of quasi-religious way that you suggest. So I do think we need to tackle the issue about financial markets here.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got Nico, please.
Hi, very much enjoyed your introduction, Michael. I haven't read the book yet. I want to ask you, and I'm intrigued by your argument about the existential elements of that are driving these movements, and also about the forms of argumentation that they make, which seem to be even more disingenuous than in previous kind of eras of political debate. But I wanted to ask you particularly about your thesis about why or how the environmental crisis and the climate crisis, inverted commas, can be recovered through innovation and progress. And I'm thinking about this not least because I've been listening to Bill Gates' rather asinine abridged book on Radio 4 today. And to his credit, he does advocate innovation, not least in agriculture and second green revolution and so on, as a way forward. But I wonder what role you see R&D, innovation and investment in both tackling the issues your book's about, but also in creating progress for people in the developing world and in the developed world. Thanks.
It's good to raise the Green New Deal, even at this late stage. That's very useful. Thank you. We have John Fender next, please.
Hi, Austin has encouraged people who are critical or potentially critical to ask questions. Well, I wouldn't say I necessarily fall in that category. I haven't read your book. I found your presentation very interesting, but I'd really like to know more about exactly what you believe and what you're advocating before deciding whether I believe, I want to criticize. I'm really not sure whether you think that environmental warming is a problem. So could I just ask you the following question? Is there a serious problem of global warming which needs to be addressed?
Short and sharp. Michael, hold your fire. Okay, thank you very much, John. I expected that from you. So we'll come back to Chrissy and then Alex still. Chrissy Des, please.
Hi. I have read the book and I loved it, but I'm going to manufacture some criticism if I can. I think the terms of the issue you dealt with absolutely brilliantly. But what I'm going to suggest is that if you try to understand environmentalism purely through the facts, the figures, the issues, that you maybe miss something, so that when you come to the end of the book and try to explain things, that's the part that was least convincing to me. Now I'm going to make a couple of points towards that if I can. The first one is what interests me is how environmentalism fits together with the other key features of what you call left liberal orthodoxy today, which I think make up a sort of triad. Where so there's environmentalism is definitely there as a key part, censorship, which we've already touched on to a certain extent, and identity politics. I want to suggest that those three things need to be taken together to understand any of them, in the sense that, well, a double sense really. that underneath this, and it could be that this is the environmentalist thinking infecting other areas of social life, is a generalized sense of fragility. If we all believe that the planet is a fragile thing, that we're at great fear and risk of destroying ourselves, that then can impact upon the sense of the self. So you end up with fragile identity, fragile individuals sort of identifying themselves in particular ways through that fragility. That can also help to explain the censorship, because there is the sort of the fear of heterodox opinion, because that could destabilize everything. And then secondly, of course, the main thing is, if we are to think of an economy which is going to shrink, then we are ultimately, we're going to have to face contests over limited, diminishing resources. And so that brings that all together. Finally, what I want to ask is might it be that it is environmentalist fears which is fueling these other fears and concerns, or could it be something else underneath which expresses itself through environmentalism, identity politics, and censorship simultaneously?
All right, thank you very much, Chrissy. And the final question goes to Alex Dale, please.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Michael, I was struck by a remark you made in your opening comments, that things can be good for the environment and good for humanity. So my question is that not contradictory, in the sense that nature, the environment as I understand it, is planless, it's random, it has no good or bad state necessarily, it just is. So when you say something can be good for nature or good for the environment, what do you mean by that? Is it possible to be good for the environment in a way that is in and of itself, or are you just talking about good for humanity through the back door? What does that mean? Can you pull that out a bit more?
Thank you very much. All right, good. We've fed you some questions there. Michael, do you want to come back on them, please?
Sure. So I'll start with the most concrete. Maybe I'll go concrete to abstract. So the concrete, do I think climate change is a problem? Yes, in the sense that all else being equal, we should not want average global temperatures to change. And the reason that we should want that is because we have constructed our built environment and our systems around a particular climate. I mean, obviously there's ranges, but you basically, we don't want to get significantly warmer or cooler in order to, because we've basically adjusted to this level of temperature. And similarly, our protected areas for the natural environment, we know that if it gets a lot warmer, we're going to probably see species migration to the poles. That risks having species move into unprotected areas. So all else being equal, we would not want climate change or any change to occur. But all else is not equal, and climate change is a consequence of human prosperity, and human prosperity is mostly good. And so we're not in a situation of climate change or not. It's really about keeping temperatures from rising more than they should have to. And so on that remark, that's why I favor efforts to continue to decarbonize the economy and decarbonize energy supplies by moving from coal to natural gas and to nuclear. On the issue of, don't we have a kind of fragile mentality? Amen, absolutely. Like the idea that sea level rise is a threat to human civilization is bizarre. I think someone had earlier asked about tipping points. So there's a passage in the book where I just go and interview. I think that one of the strengths of my book is that I interview the scientists themselves, and I get them to basically admit what their science is showing and what it's not showing. So this idea that there's some tipping point that we could cross, first of all, it's not a mainstream view. We don't know where the tipping points are. We don't know if we can affect the tipping points. Mostly people think of climate change as incremental, in terms of incremental damages from greater warming. But yeah, I mean, the idea that like a half a meter of, or 0.6 meters of sea level rise between now and 2100 constitutes some significant threat to societies is just bizarre. I mean, it's like, have you ever been to the Netherlands? I point out that much of the Netherlands is 7 meters below sea level. The country became a rich country while adapting to life under sea level. This idea that we can't withstand a little bit of sea level rise is this idea that humans are sort of helpless against environmental change. It's just ridiculous. You know, the IPCC author I talked about sea level rise with kind of pointed to Bangladesh. I mean, the future for poor Bangladeshi farmers on the coast will be determined by whether or not there's jobs in the city for them to migrate to. A lot of people, and the idea is that people want to stay in the country. A lot of people don't want to stay in the countryside. When you interview small farmers, the kids would love to go to the city. So, you know, this idea they're all going to sort of helplessly sit there on the coast as the water, you know, laps over them and they all drown is, I think, an example of that fragility mentality. And I do think you're right to think that it has a kind of autonomous agency in affecting how people think of these things. And I think it comes from a bunch of different places. I'm not sure I ever got to the bottom of it, but certainly I think that rising atheism and secularism is part of it. And the reason I think that is that there's a lot of psychological evidence that many of our fears, if not all of them, ultimately trace back to fear of death, including social fears, fears of being isolated or stigmatized or ostracized or ridiculed, are often fears of death because it is dangerous to be socially isolated. And in the past, we would comfort ourselves with traditional religions and an idea of the afterlife. But if you don't believe in that, if you're told as a child that there is no afterlife and that this is it, and there's nothing after death, and then if your life is kind of unhappy, like Greta Thunberg's life was unhappy, and then they tell you that, you know, the world is coming to an end because of climate change, I think that you end up kind of putting yourself in a spiritual crusade to try to save the planet in a really messianic, unrealistic way. And I think that's driving a lot of this panic, particularly in the rich world where people don't have significant physical threats, you know, from natural disasters or from hunger or anything else. Alex's question was about nature. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, if we define nature as kind of everything, then yeah, I mean, what's to say what's good or bad for nature? I mean it more in a kind of National Geographic sense, which is that what's good for the Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is truly one of the most fantastic wildlife reserves in the world. You know, there's mountain gorillas and elephants and giraffes and incredible species. So when I say nature, I mean Virunga Park. And what's good for Virunga Park is what's good for the small farmers that are threatening the park because they're farming right inside the park or on the frontier. And that is, cities are good, energy consumption is good, prosperity is good because it pulls the pressure off of the park and it also raises living standards in the city. So I just meant it in a much more banal National Geographic sense. In other words, I meant it in an unscientific sense when I say it would be good for nature. It would be good for achieving the goals that the vast majority of us share, you know, which is, I think most people would like to see wild animals continue to exist and to see some amount of biodiversity in our parks. Austin, did I address them?
Yeah. Well, just two final things. There's the kind of Green New Deal question of financial markets. Maybe they sit together. I'd be interested to hear your view on the Green New Deal. And then I suppose the last question, which may be the first question, is actually global warming happening? What are you talking about, Michael? Of course it's happening. So is it a problem?
I mean, so I think climate change is real. I think it's mostly caused by humans. It's not the end of the world, and it's not our most serious environmental problem. And then I favor the policies that I mentioned. Our goal should be to keep things from, you know, getting hotter than they should, as much as we can, basically, is my view. I'm opposed to geoengineering, by the way. I'm opposed to deliberately cooling the planet. I think it can't be done democratically. I think there are risks of unintended consequences, not because I believe in the precautionary principle, but because I just think it's madness for a variety of reasons. I think financial markets just mostly reflect the political culture and the values of the society at a given moment. I mean, we had tulip mania. You know, we had in the United States, I don't know if it made the news over there, we had this whole GameStop stock thing where people were trying to defend a stock that was being shorted by traders. You know, you have some financial investments moving around. Some of that stuff happens in the short term. But I mean, you know, I have people kind of going, you know, people say, there's this idea both on the activist side, but then also I see it reflected sometimes in people in business, which is that if everybody starts investing in renewables and not investing in oil and gas, then we're going to switch to renewables and use less oil and gas. No way. I mean, it's a physical problem. I mean, we don't use petroleum-based cars because we've been brainwashed by the petroleum industry. We use petroleum-based cars because they continue to outperform electric vehicles. There's some people that say electric vehicles are just as good as petroleum-based cars. If so, then we will see a rapid switch to electric vehicles. I'm not seeing that rapid switch occur because I don't think electric vehicles give consumers the things they need. Now, maybe consumers are being irrational. That would be determined over time. You know, but for me, you know, it doesn't matter how low Exxon stock price goes. Oil and gas remain dominant for inherently physical and technological reasons, not because we've been locked into those fuels. And also, I don't think just because a bunch of pension funds decide that they want to invest in them.
Excellent. Michael, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure. Great book. I just think there's one thing which Chrissy mentioned at the very end there about data not being enough. I mean, there's enough data in there as it happens, but that conversation, which it gets into the discussion about religion, about nihilism, about, you know, those kind of more philosophical or ideological perspectives, I think are more, in some ways, more interesting on a political level than just kind of reciting whether one data set is correct or not. But I think that there's an interesting situation where environmentalists used to have, even environmentalists used to have a vision of a better world, whether you agreed with it or not. But now I think you point out in the book that they spend their time staving off extinction, which is hardly the most compelling vision, which is what interesting as to why so many people are kind of joining in on it. But there's a difference between that kind of mitigation, taking action to solve something, and resilience, which I find a little bit kind of creepy, where people are preparing for the worst, fatalistically accepting that the worst will happen, and then how do we rebuild from it? It's almost like a doomsday scenario. So I think that there's a lot of, as you say, religion, I might call it just fatalism. There's definitely an anti-human angle, a misanthropic angle, and in some ways there's a racial neo-colonial angle, whatever we want to call it. So that's why I think this book is interesting. It's kind of ultimately should be applauded for its bravery in some respects, taking the flak so that we don't have to. But it's a really kind of interesting and detailed philosophical engagement with contemporary political nihilism, I think. So by all means, those of you who haven't read it, get annoyed by it, challenge it, come back to Michael on it, but read it first, which a number of reviewers obviously haven't done. So I can just applaud you, Michael. Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's very, very kind of you to do this, and wonderful hands across the sea to see you in California. One day we'll see you in London, I hope, when the world's gone less mad.
I'd love that.
Thank you very much. Can we unmute and give Michael a rousing round of applause? Well deserved. Thank you very much.